here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week, it's going to be the turn of Alfie Agnew, who I spoke to very recently about life, love, poetry and all the other groovy stuff. Has had an interest and varied career in music and other bits and pieces that you'll find out about in this fascinating interview. But his current project goes under the title Professor and the Madman, who's got a new album that is coming out very soon, well, this month, August 2026, titled Dreamworld, which is going to be on Fuller Tone Records. I'll put a link in the notes below so you'll find out more information. But this is the interview, so after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject of the early formative years. Alfie, over to you.
Wow. Okay. So I was born in 1969. So a little bit later, I had the good fortune to have older brothers who were very into music. And what was nice about that is they did a lot of the sort of filtering for me, and they were very excited to share, what they were interested in. So for me, as early as I can remember, definitely British invasion stuff. So the Beatles were king in my house. Kinks, even everything down to like Joe Cocker, certainly the Hollies, the Zombies, all of that was some of my earliest memories. But I mean, most of the discs we had in the house were Beatles, the Capitol Records versions.
Right. Yes.
Was all available for us. But very quickly after that, there was so I was very, very young listening to this stuff, literally 3, 4, 5 years old. But soon after that, Prague, my oldest brother, who was sort of the music curator in our house, really went into the deep end with prog and hard rock. So Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Certainly, David Bowie's sort of in a class of his own, but he was in the house. I remember, an early album I remember loving, and to this day, is Diamond Dogs.
Right.
Yes, Genesis, Foxtrot is still an old favorite of mine. Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, so the hard rock stuff, Led Zeppelin. So this sort of came in and joined all the more pop psychedelic stuff.
Yes.
So that those two, or maybe three. So let's say 60s, especially the psychedelics, Pink Floyd for sure. And then the hard rock and the prog, those were the three earliest and deepest influences.
Yes. So were you the youngest of three boys?
Yes, there was a sister that's older than me as well. But there was the three brothers for sure, and I am the youngest. That's correct.
Right, because I'm the youngest of three boys as well. There was quite a gap between me and the other two. I think they were quite close, and there was like 5 years, and then I came along. So it was quite interesting. I think my parents they were a bit more casual about it then, whereas the first, like my oldest brother, it was a bit more uptight for lots of reasons. Also, he was born I suppose it was 57, so there was that sort of, my mum had been offered the thalidomide drug to say, we can take the pain away. Thank God she didn't take it. And then, so there was that. And there was a book, Dr. Spock, How to Bring Up Children, not the one from Star Trek, but there was a very strict sort of way of feeding, not feeding, all this kind of stuff. So I think my poor brothers got all that, and I definitely didn't get any of that at all. So quite relieved. But anyway, my oldest brother, who was 7 years older, he was into prog, and I'd sneak into his room and look at these records when I was very young, after being forbidden to, and just playing them and being absolutely mesmerized, because they weren't on Top of the Pops, they weren't on daytime radio, but it was Genesis, Wishbone Ash, Barclay James Harvest. But funny enough, there was like a Black Sabbath and a Deep Purple album in there as well, and Rainbow, Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow album also crept in there, alongside Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Elton John and Sgt. Pepper. And that was quite mind-blowing. So that was like the mid-70s, early to mid-70s. It was very exciting.
Oh, yeah. It's funny. Your family structure and all that stuff and the music, it almost could be mistaken for me in my experience. So for example, my oldest brother, the one I mentioned that really sort of curated the music for our house. He was born in 58, so he's 10 years older than me. Whereas the middle brother is actually 1964. So he's 5 years older than me. My oldest brother is a little over 10 years older than me. So that's kind of how, so he was already becoming a young teenager by the time I was born. And so that's how he got into that sort of more teenage music. We weren't very close. We were definitely separated more, which again made it perfect. So when I was, walking around in diapers at 3 years old or whatever, I'd wander into my teenage brother's room and he'd have, at that point it was like velvet blacklight posters of Jimi Hendrix, right? And the blacklight and, incense and, the record player playing this prog. So I'd just go in there as a little kid and trip out, but that's kind of what I was raised on.
Yes, well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Did he have the smell of patchouli in the air as well?
Absolutely.
Right,
Yeah,
excellent.
absolutely.
Roger Dean posters on the wall.
Yeah, and then we're close enough in age. The kind of 70s Gothic stuff that was on the television. And that was there was a lot of horror movies and things like that. A lot of them coming from Britain, but also some from the U.S. And so the atmosphere was very imaginative. Had a very strong mystical quality to it compared to, say, the early 60s or the 80s. And so I always thought that contributed a lot to my own creativity, and thinking in terms of imagination rather than,
Yes.
So it was a great time to be born, I think.
Well, I suppose we grew up with things like the Munsters and Bewitched on telly as well. So they were,
Sure.
And we also had the Carry On films. I'm not sure if they came to America, but we had Carry On Screaming, which was a massive influence on all our lives, really. And yes, that sort of sense of humor. So was music being not just played, but was it being strummed and sort of practiced? Was there a sort of musical vibe in the house as well?
Certainly. So it was kind of interesting. We had the three brothers, and so Rick, my oldest brother, he was kind of the ringleader, and so every new brother that was born was an addition to his band.
Right.
And so my middle brother Frank came along. Rick threw him on bass. I came along. He threw me on drums, and it started off as innocent as me having wooden spoons and pots and pans upside down.
Right. Yes.
Sort of play along with the Deep Purple records or Kiss or whatever, happened to be going on at the time. He would be on keyboards. He was a big Wakeman Emerson fan, and we would just play along to it. And again, a lot of imagination. But eventually we started getting actually able to play on real instruments. So slowly but surely, birthdays and Christmases, we would accrue some rudimentary instruments, and we taught ourselves how to play them. And we would just try to play the songs that we listened to. In some sense, it's to this day, if there's a song I hear that I really like, my first thing is to go to figure it out how to play it.
Right. Yes.
That's the way I can enjoy it.
Yeah, that's amazing. Did you? Because I mean, things like punk. My brother definitely wasn't into punk, and neither was my other brother. Did that sort of get played in the house as well? Did that sort of punk explosion sort of appear?
Absolutely. Again, one of the great things about my oldest brother in particular is he's a prodigious consumer of music, and the more provocative, the better. So. Todd Rundgren coming out dressed in drag, or David Bowie coming out with his different egos, and then punk. These were things that just fascinated and captivated my brother. And so again, one of the first things you do is say, "Hey, Frank, hey, Alfie, check this out." So I always got subjected to the most outrageous stuff. And I, as a little kid, I thought it was wonderful. And I really enjoyed it. And so punk was kind of the first thing that I think we all embraced. It was certainly something we were more than capable of playing. Just in terms of what talent we had, what development we had with our instruments. It was pretty low bar. It was one of the nice things about punk is you didn't have to be classically trained pianist to, to
Yes.
play. And punk hit, Southern California later than Britain. I think by the time we were all very into it, it was probably kind of past its peak in London, I would think.
Yes.
So we saw the stuff coming from London. We saw the stuff coming from New York in the late 70s, but we created our own scene pretty much more early 80s throughout the mid 80s was sort of the heyday of Southern California punk. So absolutely, I remember the first Damned album coming out. I remember the Pistols album coming out. And by the time it hit us, because there was no internet back then, and it wasn't easy to get copies of those albums. We looked in magazines to try to learn more about it. Generation X was one of my favorites. In the US, I mean, we were always fans of Iggy, so that was probably the earliest punk type stuff. We were big Iggy fans. Dead Boys, things like that, Television, and even a little bit more artsy stuff like Brian Eno, Roxy Music. So yeah, we really embraced it. For me, it was early teenage years, early 80s. I sort of forsook all that. I had forsaken all the other influences for a small amount of time, like teenagers often do. It was punk or nothing, right? For about 3 or 4 years. So, and I would say that's where my brothers and I made a little bit of a dent in the music history is in, Southern California punk and goth as well. Particularly my older brother, Rick, was really an early, goth person. His band Christian Death made a big bit of a dent out here. So yeah, that punk was kind of our thing, but I kind of outgrew it. By the time I was a later teenager, I was going back into my other influences. I was starting bands and especially got into composing music that wasn't simply punk. I love punk, but it wasn't, I didn't sort of exclusively stick with it forever.
No, well, it's kind of interesting because sometimes when I listen to it now, it seems remarkably tame, doesn't it? And sometimes the BBC, I remember watching it, like, I don't know, punk at the BBC and feeling like, God, this is really hard. Like Sham 69 and a lot of those bands and various people I've interviewed, who were into that early punk where, you could just be yourself, suddenly realized that there was all these Sid Vicious lookalikes at gigs and thinking, actually, this is kind of over now. It's a bit like buying hippie wigs at Woolworths, isn't it? In the late 60s, it's a bit like I think it's kind of it's kind of the dream has died. This isn't really what punk was about, and suddenly it's it gets a bit tacky, doesn't it? I think any scene has a very limited time, and then it's like the next bit is the bit where you just got to think, okay, they're just. I don't know if you ever saw that film With Nell and I. There was a lovely line about sort of like selling hippie wigs at Woolworths. And it was that thing, isn't it? Really, part-time punk and all that. So yes, but then you were in lots of bands when you were very young, weren't you? A band called The Attack, where you played drums and you were sort of wrote all the lyrics and music. So were you just a very enthusiastic young person who was very adept at sort of, I don't know, composition and composing?
Yes. Yeah, it was something I've done again ever since I could remember. I didn't have to discover that. As soon as I started forming memories, I was there trying to play an adult guitar. Even if I just had to play on one string, I was writing melodies. Of course, we learn a lot, via imitation, particularly early on. We kind of have to have some ingredients to cook with. And so a lot of my early stuff that I wrote was either very kind of 60s psychedelic or heavy, Sabbathy kind of riffs or Blackmore type riffs. So that was just something I was always excited about. It was something that I kind of did like without having to think about it. I never said, okay, I need to practice. I need to schedule. It was just something I always did. Anytime I had free time, I was just as happy going through my Monkees albums as playing outside with friends at 6 to 12 years old. So it was something that I just did. And I think it was the environment I grew up in. I don't know if there's anything, deeper biological with that, but yeah, I always did that. I always composed. I hear things in my head. I can compose in my head, so I don't actually need to be at an instrument. So this goes on a lot during a lot of my waking hours, and even sometimes not waking hours.
Yes, my God, the subconscious is working overtime here, isn't it? Your dream state must be quite an important part of your creative process, I guess.
I think so. I think so.
Yes. And was it, being very young and then sort of having bands like Christian Death sort of quite close to you, was that kind of like exciting? I mean, you were only about 12 or 13 at the time. That's quite young, isn't it, to be exposed to Christian Death at that kind of point in life?
Yeah, it is kind of interesting, and it's funny because I grew up in a Catholic household. My parents were Catholic, but by the time I came around, it wasn't very strong. Where my oldest two siblings, were required to go to Sunday school and get confirmation. By the time that me and my middle brother came around, I think my parents sort of were over that a little bit. So it wasn't a very religious household, but it was, kind of a little bit ironic for Christian Death and goth to be there. The amazing thing is my parents were very tolerant and they were strict, but they really gave us a lot of room to be creative and outrageous. I think a lot more parents would not have tolerated that. Thank goodness we didn't have any really over the top religious parents, because there's plenty of them around.
Yeah, so I'd imagine there was a few. I remember somebody who I interviewed saying that when she wanted to be in, I think just a normal band, the parents had to go to some prayer meeting and,
yeah,
like get the blessing. I mean, to say, oh, guess what? I'm in a band, and sort of thinking something quite nice and cutesy, and then go, oh, Christian Death. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, when that album appeared in the house, did your parents go, oh, well, let's just have a listen to that? I'm sure we're going to enjoy the lyrics and the imagery. How did that go down?
Yeah, fortunately, my parents weren't very meddling. So they came from a generation where it was important that you give your kids a lot of space and independence. So they're the exact opposite of the helicopter parent generation. So they didn't really screen our music at all. I remember my dad would sometimes push back and be like, do you have to be so wild? Or, can you just leave the cussing off the lyrics? Is that really necessary? But it was more important for my dad, I think, to give his kids space to just live, and to figure things out and to explore than to, be strictly adherent to any moral code. He is not like that at all. He's very much a little bit more gypsy oriented somehow, just so that was good fortune for us, because a lot of stuff's probably slipped under the radar. I don't think my parents were as aware of it, a little bit, but I think they were just let us do our thing. But for me as a young kid, you said, as you mentioned, my early teens, all that stuff was super exciting,
Yes, well, quite actually.
I mean, rebellious, I always loved horror, like I mentioned, all the 70s Gothic stuff. So when the Gothic music came around, I'm like, oh, this is fantastic. This is intense, vibey, dark. And then, of course, the energy of punk was perfect for a 12-year-old hitting his hormone stage, right? Just all the energy and the rebellion. So that was really exciting for me, actually. I mean, it had its difficulties because, one thing you might learn about Orange County if you look it up, which I don't, there's probably more important things for you to do with your time. But Orange County is extremely conservative compared to LA County. Extremely. Right. It's horrid. So being a punk in Orange County in the early 80s, late, not 70s, early 80s, was a dangerous prospect compared to being a punk in LA, because we just were so outnumbered and Orange County was so intolerant. So there were challenges for sure, but the challenges weren't inside our house, which is the case with a lot of other alternative youth.
Yes.
Actually just walking down the street and not getting hit with a bottle. or going to school and trying to
Yes.
beat up,
Because we had Thatcher over in the UK, you would have had Reagan,
Yes.
and there was a sort of huge wave of enthusiasm and excitement, and Reaganomics, which kind of worked so well, didn't it? But yes, but it was kind of interesting. And we also had the Falkland Crisis War, and then we had the miners' strike. So it was a bit of a grim time. So in the UK, there's a huge amount of unemployment. I guess the US was doing a little bit better economically at that stage.
Yeah, the 80s in particular, I think we were doing okay. 70s is when we were struggling more, the Iran crisis,
Yes.
the gas rationing, stock market had kind of really stalled in the 70s. So things got a little, like, depending on who you were, I think the economy was a little bit more robust in the 80s. However, there was a cost to be, that was deferred. But I think there was a lot of pushback on this sort of trying to get back to a 1950s society. I think in the 60s and the 70s, I think we kind of pushed that away, but then it started kind of coming back as the pendulum swings between liberalism and conservatism. Right now, of course, we're having another kind of 80s over here, unfortunately. So for those of us that didn't want to wear the uniform and just be part of the flock, it was a challenging time.
I suppose the big albums at that time, I suppose a few years later in the mid-80s, there was Bruce Springsteen, but you'd had people like Michael Jackson, wouldn't you? And Whitney Houston, and who a little bit later, then you had the LA hair metal period, which was rather spooky, really. I guess you would have had yacht rock, the end bits of yacht rock with that huge production and quality. Yes. Michael McDonald, he must have been big at that time. I'm just it was kind of, in this country, we had that Trevor Horn production sound that, was dominated the charts with, I suppose, ABC and Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, Sade, but then we had the indie scene because there was a huge amount of unemployment in the UK. So I think a lot of people, we had very easy social security benefit systems where when you're young, you think, oh, that's fantastic. And then a lot of people just went on the dole and formed bands. And we had, like the 3 weekly music papers, John Peel, people like that, who was very keen to promote it. So there was a sort of a very good platform at that stage as well. So people, and the UK is tiny, isn't it? And every city and town has their little indie punk alternative night. So you could get that little transit van tour around the country and do about 20 dates quite easily, really. So, yes, it did create quite a lot of, opportunity to sort of spare time to have, putting out records and doing that stuff, actually. So then, so just going back then, you were in several bands, Attack and then Almost 21 that you were in. And then after that, you formed DI, didn't you?
Yes.
So was that the first proper band that sort of hit the
Yeah, I would say so. Actually, so DI had been around prior, actually, before I joined it. So it was a band that my brother was a central figure in. My brother Rick, the same one from Christian Death and the Adolescents, which were all big punk and goth bands in Southern California early on, helped kind of define the scene out here. Another person was Casey Royer, also in DI and Adolescents, another one of the older spokesmen, early punks in the area, along with Mike Ness from Social Distortion and some of those other sort of forefathers of Southern California punk. So Rick and Casey had formed a band DI after Rick and Casey had left the Adolescents. However, it never really got off the ground a whole lot. There was one version of the band that made it into the punk movie Suburbia, if you've heard of that, and which was a pretty neat movie because there wasn't anything at that scale that could be in the theaters at the time. Mm-hmm. So there was a version of that band they had put out an EP, but it didn't last. And that's when I joined DI. Almost 21 had disbanded, and it was me, Rick, and Casey, and I brought a couple friends from Almost 21 with me. And that formed the band that was probably the most productive and well-known version of the band, in the heyday in the 80s. So we had put out 3 records. We were, supporting Social Distortion in the area. And if I may say so, I think there was more enthusiasm for our sets at the time. I think Social Distortion really hit another level when Mike Ness sort of changed directions and went more to that Johnny Cash type thing as opposed to punk. Because
Yes.
at that time, this is maybe, let's say, the mid 80s, early to mid 80s, punk had started getting really aggressive, and, like the hardcore scene had really hit. And DI, much like the Adolescents, was a very musical version of that kind of hardcore energy. So we weren't like, I really don't have a lot of flavor for just play as fast as you can, scream as loud as you can. Songs are 36 seconds. That's cool, but it wasn't my thing. We always like to actually harmonize and try to come up with some interesting, compositional elements in our music, even if it was punk. I think that went over very well. We had a little bit of a surf and skate vibe to DI that seemed to be attractive to people. So we did really well, but ultimately disbanded because for the usual reasons, which was kind of too bad because we disbanded shortly before punk made the leap to commercial viability, and then in the early 90s with your Green Day and
Yes.
bands like that. A lot of those bands sort of saw DI and Adolescents and early Social Distortion. I think those bands were influenced a lot by these people. Even the grunge, a lot of the grunge bands like Nirvana and Soundgarden, Chris Cornell and these folks were opening. Green Day was opening for DI and during European tours in the early 90s. But just personality wise and business savvy wise, I don't think we just had it together well enough to make that leap like those other bands did. And I'm really proud of those bands for doing it.
Yeah. Did you ever come across or hear about that festival that took place? I think it was the 83, possibly 84, Desolation Center, the one that was in the desert. There was a film about it a few years ago that came out.
Oh,
And that
sounds
had all the bands like Sonic Youth, Minutemen, Meat Puppets,
yeah,
Red Cross. Can you
exactly.
remember? And they did 2. I think they did one in the desert and one on a ship, a cruise. And then I think they thought we better stop doing that because that's going to end in tears. But yes, I don't know if you ever came. I just wondered because that was 83, 84. So you were probably about on the scene a bit, and those bands must have been kind
Certainly.
of familiar to you.
Certainly. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of those bands are from this general area, maybe a little bit more LA than OC, but yeah.
Yes, and on your record covers, they're quite unusual, aren't they? They're quite proggy, actually. The
Yes.
sort of ancient artifacts. I mean, that's very prog-tastic, isn't it? Really, Roger D.
Absolutely.
Who was the designer for that?
I forget the name of the person, but we would actually commission paintings for that. Again, it's very prog. So I already mentioned my interest in prog. Rick is the one who turned me on to prog. And Casey Royer, the singer of DI, was the biggest Yes fan you'll ever find. So there is a lot of that there. And again, so instead of just showing someone screaming into a mic with a mohawk for your front cover, we're a little bit more artistic, I'd like to think, than that. And so it was natural for us to commission these paintings. I forget the name of the person. He was a Southern California artist. And he would make these really cool paintings. And we said, do what you think. Here's the name of the record, but here's
Right.
this little Aztec monkey dog thing, the DI dog, we call it. Just put it in there somewhere. That's going to be kind of the common thread in all our cover art. And so we put the time and money, to get proper artwork. And we just kept running with it. Yeah. Yeah. Really proud of that, actually.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. That's quite striking, actually. Because you're on the second album, weren't you? Horse Bites, Dog Cries. That
Certainly.
was the second. Did you? Because that was were you on 2 of their studio albums, or 3?
It's of course, like a lot of things, is that there's like a lot of nuance to it. So the first album, Ancient Artifacts, was released with the lineup I was in, but a lot of those recordings were done prior. Um, and so the first album where all the music was the band you see on the back cover was Horsebite Dog Cries.
Right.
Then there was another album, Team Goon, released after that, which was the Suburbia EP I mentioned earlier, together with some new material. And so again, you'll see my lineup. I think we had a different drummer, but aside from that, the same Horsebites lineup on the back cover. But not all the music is from the same time, because this was very DIY, as punk was at that point. And so, you tried to release products the best you can. Getting studio time was difficult and very expensive, so we couldn't afford to record whole albums like we can easily now in our bedrooms.
Yes.
So we did a lot of, oh, hey, there's these demo tapes, rolling around. Let's sort of put artwork and our pictures on it and really, get it transferred to vinyl. We know some, some people who can serve as our managers, that are doing some questionable business, and they have enough money to put, the capital up front. And, so we would go ahead and release records that way. But recording new material for albums was difficult because it was expensive in the 80s.
Yes, because there's quite a theme on side 2 of that sort of particular one, the album Horse Bites, Dog Cries. You got a gun, spiritual law, stick to your guns, live in the USA. Was it sort of were you kind of very sort of driven by that political and social sort of period? Was that sort of reflection of a lot of the music on that album?
I've been thinking about that a lot as I've gotten older, because just looking around me, especially the last 10 years, just how things evolve and how things swing back and forth. I haven't fully thought it through yet, but I've thought about it quite a bit. And here's what I have as of today. So it was the 80s, as we were discussing. It was Reagan. It was, very, conservative, tough guy, U.S. military. We were, there was a lot of film on TV of stuff going on in the Middle East, and we had these questionable involvements all over the globe. And we were young, right? I mean, I was, I think, 13 or 14 when I first joined DI, and we don't have a lot of political education in our K through 12, our high school. So we're just seeing all this stuff on TV, and it's, and of course at the time the Cold War hadn't ended, so there was the whole nuclear war tension with the Soviet Union at the time. So it was just a lot of stress and confusion. And I think what we were singing about was the stuff that we were being exposed to on the television and on the radio in terms of news. And we didn't really have good context for it. And it wasn't really well explained or completely explained. And it was exciting in a negative way and frightening. And so I think we were just venting all of that anxiety and anger, right?
Yes.
A very angry world, kind of like it is now. And so
yes.
I don't think our lyrics, especially, because I look back at a lot of them, and some of them I shake my head. I'm like, what the hell were we singing about? But I understand now that it's just us just being a mirror. It's not like we have thought carefully. We've written our dissertation on politics, and our lyrics are a statement of our political stand. It's absolutely not that. We're too young or too stupid to really do that. This was, we were just mirroring the insanity of the times.
Yes. Well, it's
and there was a
interesting.
lot of guns and military stuff in there.
Yes. Well, I suppose we had the US bases, didn't we? We had Greenham Common, so that was it. And then, there was that When the Wind Blows. So there was always a sense of some nuclear war. Then there was Chernobyl in, I think that was 86. So that was kind of a grim period as well. And at that stage, Thatcher got so powerful and so big in this country that there was there was something called Red Wedge, which was a sort of political movement, mostly for young bands to try and galvanize the youth. And we'd all vote and Thatcher would get kicked out and it would be like, yeah, it didn't happen at all. And I know everyone kept sort of writing dissertations and books on sort of does music change people's political voting? And I think it might. And then you think, no, not even slightly. Don't bother anymore. It's so depressing, but it has so little impact, doesn't it? Really, I remember election nights thinking, oh, this is definitely the one, and then sort of the party suddenly takes a bit of a, I might just go home. I think that's it. It's not going well. But we wrote great songs, So
Right.
where's all the young people voting? They're just more older people voting, I'm afraid. So there you go.
Yeah.
Suck it and see, mate. Yeah, it's a weird one, isn't it, really, that whole period? So yes, you did those albums. And then you left the band. What's the reason for leaving the band at that stage?
Yeah, so it was kind of interesting. So DI I was in, let's say 14 through about 18 years old. So this was the mid 80s. And I actually even joined the second version of the Adolescents had come into existence in 1987. And at some point I had joined that to do their second album with them and to do some touring. So DI was really doing well and doing a lot of road trips and touring. The Adolescents had come together and was doing touring. And I had, let's say around 1985, so halfway through that process, sort of had this epiphany that I enjoyed school and academics. And I think I had started to grow up in some sense. Not that I like the music or any of that any less, but I think I had an intellectual awakening at some point because school was pretty much something I avoided and put as little effort into as possible so I could focus on music. And I didn't care for academics most of my life, although it all came very easily to me. So that was handy because I could do a lot of work in a small amount of time, get good enough grades to please, to stay out of hot water with my parents.
Yes.
And then be able to, okay, great, now I can go spend time on music. But I actually started getting attracted to ideas at some point, maybe around 16 years old. And so at some point I decided, well, I want to continue to explore these things. And so going to university was the obvious way to do that. And so I had been on a path where sort of parallel train tracks. I was doing music and doing relatively well in music. And however, wanting to also pursue academics, I had graduated from high school, had started university, and my music was actually helping me pay for my university, which was fantastic.
God, that's a very good trade-off, actually, at that stage.
Yeah, and of course, I started getting into science and things like that, which takes quite a bit of effort and time, and I was enamored with it. But I started running out of hours in a day. I would be, going up the California coast, doing a string of shows and having to, train home in the middle of the night to try to hit an 8 a.m. exam, on no sleep. So it just got untenable.
Right.
And so I had to make a decision at some point. I was at a fork in the road. Things started disintegrating within the band just in terms of the personality structure. And, I made an extremely hard decision after growing up completely absorbed in music and dreaming of making it in music. I made an extremely difficult decision to prioritize my academics. And so I left both bands.
Yes, but you'd been on the brats in battalions. That was it. Did you enjoy touring, by the way?
I did. Yeah, I did. And sometimes I still will. So there's a version of the Adolescents, the Adolescents kind of forked in two different directions. The original singer, Tony, has the Adolescents proper and has kept that for ages. And then about 10 years ago, my oldest brother and some of the original members, along with Casey, had done a version where they called the Adolescents with a little R in front. At this point, it's all very legacy. So what? And there's a lot of people who enjoy the legacy stuff. And every once in a while, I'll sub, for that band. And it's wonderful. I've gone to Hawaii, I've gone to Quebec, I've gone to the East Coast, and the Pacific Northwest. So sometimes I'll tour with them. And it's great fun. Absolutely great fun. I still love it. I loved it before. I just wish I had 2 lifetimes for it all.
Yes, well, absolutely. So for the next 20 years, then it was kind of academia and study, and that was kind of your focus.
100%. I had given myself 100% to it. I had done some side bands, and I continued to compose and consume music, but it was sort of a distant second. So I went off to university or graduate school up in Oregon, got my PhD, did some postdoctoral work in Dallas, and then got a job as an assistant professor back in my undergraduate institution in Southern California. So I kind of made a big circle. And in academia, that first 10 years is really intense and delicate. You got to work extremely hard and focus. The way that it works over here is, and I'm sure most other places is, in your first decade, you're establishing your career and your scientific research reputation. If it works out, you get your tenure. If it doesn't, then your career is permanently altered.
Yes.
So it's a real intense thing. And so I focused on that. I was successful, moved up the promotion ladder. And right about the time I hit the top of the ladder, in the early 2010s, it just was great timing again. I had some old friends from DI who had stayed in the music world sort of reach out and said, "Hey, we heard you back in Southern California again. We're doing an album of material from some of our old bands, Almost 21 and a band Crash Kills 4 that they had been involved in when I was in the full-time academia." And so they brought me in there, and we had such a great time. We said, "Hey, let's run with this a little bit." So we put out an album but under the name Crash Kills 4, an album called A Raincoat and Shoes and Pornographic Blues, which was an Almost 21 song, actually, that the singer and myself had co-written, singer Jay McCarty, and it was fantastic. And we commissioned a painting for the cover, which was great. And that was great fun. We played some shows, and then I hooked up with an old mate from DI, a later version of DI, Sean Elliott, who I'd been friends with but lost contact with, like I did everybody in music for a while. And we formed a band called Professor and the Madman, based on kind of our personalities. And that's what I've been involved with ever since that. So that kind of the present.
My God, that all lines up so nicely, doesn't it? So that was like 2015. That all started to sort of materialize. God, Madman. So yeah. So did you then? Because actually, bizarrely, my partner's had an academic life, and then sort of, like you said, the first 10, 15 years, it was all about getting funding. Oh, I've got a 18-month contract. Oh, we've got 5 years, but then you get a bit more establishment, and then you just keep on that sort of treadmill, don't you, really? Until you start thinking, I might drop a day, I might drop 2 days, I might retire soon, I can't cope.
Exactly right.
It's kind of interesting. I think it's like I'm getting burnt out. There's the academic kind of side, there's the admin side, there's the teaching side. There's just too much, it's like what. Yeah, it's like just like dealing with weepy students who is hard enough. I think you plagiarize. And it's difficult. You must find it. Like a student think they're being a bit of a smart ass, and you think, kid.
Oh yeah.
I can see through it, and you don't quite know what my past, but so you could have to be a bit smarter to cheat on your paper than that, by the way. And they start weeping, and then you think, gee, now I've got to go and write and get funding for my next, and then you got to take on some PhD students. So yeah, I mean, she just went, but like you said, that first 10, 15 years, you just do it, don't you? You go, I'm going to conferences and I get paid to do it, and then you think, I'm going to let somebody else do the conferences, because to be honest, I don't care about the conferences anymore. I don't want to meet people and say, oh, what's your project and what are you working on and all that. You just think,
Yeah.
you get a new fresh student who say, do you want to go to a conference? They go, yeah, that's great. You think, oh, well done, bye bye.
Yes.
Yes. Is it
Yes.
quite similar to that?
Oh, certainly, you've nailed it. I think the only thing I would add to that is so you put down, you put your head down and just work for those first 10 to 15 years. Now, one of the positive results of that is it's kind of like you're planting the seeds, you're growing the tree, you're throwing away some of the first fruit. It's kind of like gardening. And then at some point you have this mature orchard, which bears a lot of fruit with just a maintenance amount of time and effort. And again, like I'm still enamored with all of this stuff, but in terms of, living a sort of monk-like life and giving no attention to any other aspects of your life, I don't, for me anyway, it was a little hard to do that more than 10 to 15 years, to have such a lack of balance. But again, once I sort of got to the point to where I had that mature research and teaching orchard, I could be as productive while carving out more time for things like music and family and friends and relationships and things like that. So I didn't really have to rely on my tenure. I'm still productive. I still am productive. I still work on research, even though I'm basically in a retirement phase, like kind of an off-ramp sort of retirement phase. But it's been more balanced. I did do 5 years of administration. I was department head. That probably was even harder just because of the nature of the work. 5 years is all I could handle. But it was important work because somebody's got to do it and protect the younger faculty. There were people who did that for me. So it was all good stuff I'm all proud of, but it's certainly exhausting, especially in the academic climate of the early 2020s. Things are kind of wacky and out of balance. There was a lot of curveballs like COVID that we weren't prepared for. So it was really stressful, but it was really important.
Yes, I guess so. Did you have those decisions, or like you're looking at a course that have only got 3 students, and you're thinking we do need to ramp up some different courses, because the courses that we did in the 70s and 80s were quite popular. They're not popular now, but the lecturers are going, you can't do that. These are really important. It's like, yeah, but we only get 3 students come to your class, and actually it's costing a lot of money. As a head, did you have to deal with those situations and think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's funny that you should mention that particular problem, because that's probably one of the most heartbreaking aspects, but it's also very important. It doesn't have to be all negative, because you work so hard and you have such passion, for the academic system as you grew up in. But by the time you get well established and you're, either a senior faculty member or a department head, the world has changed. And it's like, well, shoot, I spent 40 plus years sort of with this mindset, and you're thinking I'm going to create and improve in these ways, but the world has other ideas.
Yes.
And it's really hard for people to let that go. Even brilliant academic people, they, in some sense, they might be at an extra disadvantage because I think they can get a little too locked in. They can get a little bit of tunnel vision. That can be good when you're working on a highly technical area, but it can be bad when you're trying to adjust to reality in the world.
Yes.
So yes, it's hard to let things go. In particular, it was very personal to me because the area I was in is sort of a theoretical mathematical physics area, which was very exciting, very sexy. We had a lot of curriculum in that area, is one of the reasons why I joined the faculty where I did. But basically that program's now all but gone, because you bring in different faculty with different ideas. They want to take things different ways. They're more computer oriented than sort of theory oriented. And there's not enough students and resources to have it all. So applied mathematics changed a lot during my time at Cal State Fullerton, the university I'm at. And, as a faculty member, I could fight more for that. But as a department head, I had to be neutral and think of the faculty that are there and that are going to be there after I'm gone. And in terms
Yes.
of the health of the program, where is the world, and there's no doubt that our students, I mean, when I do advising, I always say this, even though I'm not a big computer programming person, if I have a student that's like, well, I like math and all, and I want to, be in math and or physics. However, I'm not looking to go to graduate school. Then my first thing is make sure you get a lot of programming experience, whether you like it or not, because that's what you're going to be able to get a job with, with a 4-year degree. Having a sort of 17th century understanding of theory isn't going to really make you valuable to a company, which is where you're looking at being with a 4-year degree. To do advanced fancy stuff, you're going to have to go to graduate school in the US. So I try to steer the bachelor's degree level students into practical areas, and it's all based around computers and programming and machine learning and AI and all that stuff.
Oh, I know. God, that's hard work, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
God, so getting the band together and bringing
Yes.
out albums must be such a relief. So, because there's a couple, I mean, you've done a hell of a lot, actually. So, the Live at the 100 Club, this was
Yeah.
recorded in London, wasn't it?
Correct.
So, was that the first one with Rat Scabies on? Or was he with the band before then?
Rat was actually with the band before then. So Rat has done all the recordings. So our first release as Professor and the Madman was this sort of 3/4 album called Good Evening, Sir.
Yes.
And we're putting the songs together. We started pre-production, and we had bumped into Rat at a show, and sort of said, "Hey, why don't you come over our studio tomorrow and lay down some tracks if you got nothing going on, And he was like, "Yeah, let's do it." So it was kind of, again, just good timing, good fortune, and so he showed up, and we recorded a couple of songs, and he really enjoyed it. We really enjoyed it. It's like, hey, why don't you do the whole album with us? And so Rat was a part of Sean and I's project basically from the first album. So he's been on all the records. Paul Gray joined us in 2018, and so he started with our third album called Disintegrate Me, and then he was also on the 100 Club show. So he's on that record as well, and he's been with us ever since.
Yeah, and you had David Allen producing on that Good Evening, Sir, as well? Was it David?
That's correct.
Like, God, that must have been really amazing to work with such a producer.
Absolutely. It was, we couldn't have been more fortunate. He'd done some amazing stuff, obviously, stuff that I recall when I was growing up, and he's a real cool dude, very, very intelligent, very talented. It was getting Rat and Dave Allen on board was a very fortunate way to start this new project.
Fantastic. So when you came over to do that live recording at the 100 Club, did you do other dates, or was it specifically for that project?
It was just that project.
And then from that, you recorded this follow-up album, which was 2020, isn't it? Which was the previous recording. Now this one. So how did this idea come together, by the way? The fifth Séance.
Oh, Séance, yeah. So Sean and I, so we do all the songwriting and the concepts, and so it's really kind of our baby. And Sean has a very similar background to myself musically. So he knows the prog stuff. Getting Elton John, David Bowie, even some of the some of the rock opera type stuff. Everything from Tommy and Rocky Horror Picture Show, and
I suppose Jim Steinman, really, isn't it?
Yeah, like a lot of that stuff that was happening in the 70s were really influential. And so we always kind of wrote our albums almost like it should be a rock opera and something. So we have a lot of visuals that go on. So there's a story, and the albums tends to be a concept kind of thing. I know that's become a little bit cliche, but it's not our problem. If we enjoy it, we'll do it anyway. And so with Séance, we had this rough story arc, and it's kind of, the rough story arc is is, first of all, starts with the song Séance, and it's about thinking back towards the times we were talking about and our friends, and oh my gosh, look how far we've come and what's going on. It would be great if we could go back and talk to some of our friends that are no longer here, right? So there's the lyric in the song, turn the lights out, close your eyes, light the candle, we're going to see our friends. And, that's what the Séance is about. And so just to try to connect after all this time that somehow passed, that we didn't see it passing. And then the story kind of evolves to, the planet and the misuse of it, and an alien, I know it's going to sound wild, but this is just how we have the alien race kind of putting it right. And then by the time the closing track comes in, it's basically like, look, we'll clean this up for you, but don't mess up a second time or you'll see us again. So there's a lot more to the story, but roughly speaking, there's this interesting kind of, almost Greek Odyssey kind of arc. And I'm just giving you very small pieces of it, so it probably doesn't make a ton of sense. But we have these, rough ideas in mind, and we string songs and lyrics together very roughly based on that. We're not trying to literally make a Peter and the Wolf,
right?
To be exact, but there's just a general vibe. And Séance was probably our most sort of grand effort in that way.
Yes, God, that's right. And then that was 19. Obviously, we had lockdown. So when did the new album start to get sort of written and recorded?
So the way Sean and I work is we're compulsive composers. So we're always kind of writing stuff. We release a small amount of stuff that we either have written in part or in total. And so what we do is the album we release is a combination of things we're currently most excited about, together with material that we've addressed sometimes many years ago, but that would make a nice cohesive collection of songs, or perhaps even fit a story arc for a whole record. So for example, in our new album that's coming out next month, Dreamworld, there's a song on it called The Light, which is a song I wrote back in 2015. And I was expecting it to be on one of the early albums, but it never quite fit, the collection that we were working on at the time. The first album, Good Evening, Sir, is a little bit more kind of dark Gothic, a little bit theater. And so The Light didn't really work on that collection. Right? No. And so it got bumped necessarily. And it's a very 60s-ish song. When we started thinking of the new album for Dreamworld, and this was not long after Séance, Sean and I really got sidetracked in some stuff. That's when I was doing my department head stuff. Sean owns a couple of companies. He keeps them very busy. And so this album was really meant to be 2021, 2022, but poof, 5 years went by and no album. So we're finally getting it out. But the thing that came out, the theme that came out was more of a 60s psychedelic thing. We had that we had reached a critical mass of songs that were highly influenced by a lot of those 60s bands I mentioned growing up listening to. And so The Light was perfect for that. A song we just released called Tolerant World, really sounds kind of 64 Beatles. And, it's not us trying to rip off or, it's just, let's say like XTC, right?
Yes.
Like XTC, people can say, oh, they sound very Beatlesy. Are they just trying to be a Beatles copy? No, they're just probably very influenced by them and are embracing that influence. So there's kind of a difference, I think, than people that are either purposely trying to rip off or not doing a classy enough job of that, and people just embracing a genre or an influence that's dear to them. And so I like to think of Dreamworld as this is us sort of doing what we would have done if we were 20 years old in between 1964 and 1969.
Yes, yes. I get it. Yeah, it's interesting because it wasn't quite what I expected when I played it. And I was thinking, oh, this is much more sort of, sort of very cultured pop, really. I don't, it's yes. Like, this is very, easy to consume and kind of intriguing. It was like, I didn't know why, but I expected it to all be a bit more jagged, but it wasn't at all, is it? It's just much more sort of It starts with Dreamworld, doesn't it? This is your
Yes.
your opening track. How did this song come about? What was the sort of origin to this little number?
So Dreamworld, so this was a song I led on compositionally, and I've never really left my love of the 60s other than, my 3 year hardcore punk only teenage phase. And the 60s have always been dear to me. And, so other 60s bands that have had an influence on me, particularly even ones that I've discovered later in life. Well, actually, the Beach Boys, I was influenced by all my life. So the Beach Boys were a big influence for that song. Nilsson, I don't know if you remember Harry Nilsson.
Oh yeah, my God, I can't live if living is without you, which is when I
Yes.
remember that as he was not 60s, but it was like 72, I think, wasn't it?
Yes. Yes.
But yes, I have gone back and listened to some of his as well. So yeah,
Yeah.
that had a profound effect. I think there was a lot of romantic melancholia in the
Absolutely.
charts during that period because there was that one. There was also another song by Terry Jacks called "Seasons in the Sun," which I think was written by a Belgian guy called Serge Gainsborough. Oh, I don't know. I'm probably making it up now. But yeah, it was all very tragic. It was like basically a love and then death at the end. And when you're on the school bus at the age of, I don't know, probably 8 or 9, it all felt very, I don't know, it was quite interesting. I loved the work of the Carpenters, the lyrical content of the Carpenters
Of the Carpenters.
sort of, and then, you listen to Joy Division and the Smiths and you think there is a connection. It's just all about sadness and loneliness, which sort of seemed to appeal to me. Even Roger Whittaker had a few songs which had a
Yeah.
romanticness about them. So, yes. Well, he did a song called New World Today, and you've done one called Brave New World, haven't you?
Oh, Brand New World. Yes.
Brand New World, sorry. Yes.
No, that's okay. Yeah. Yeah. So with Dreamworld, though, maybe I'll just kind of cap that one off. So Dreamworld, very Nilsson-esque and very Beach Boys Smile, Brian Wilson Smile, I think were probably, like, now that I listen to it, were my biggest influences. In fact, I'll give you a funny little tidbit. If you think of how Dreamworld starts, go back and listen to Harry Nilsson's One.
Right.
Yes.
Is the loneliest number.
Yeah,
Yes.
that it starts with that piano dun dun dun. So that was a little bit of a direct homage to Harry Nilsson's One, and just an absolutely brilliant song. But then when you get to the backing vocals and the ba ba ba's, that's very Smile Beach Boys. On the other hand, the lyrics are motivated by my agitation with what I was hearing, like, for example, politically on social media, just the lack of connection to reality. And so the lyrics are quite dark. It has to do with, how people are so disconnected from reality, and they're living and getting all their ideas through social media, and they're just embracing, like, it's true if I think it is, rather than objectivity.
Right.
People living through video games instead of being productive, people, and how that could breed some horrible personalities.
Yes, a sort of post-truth age.
Yes, that's exactly it. And the insanity that I think has to be attendant with that. And hence, when the song, halfway through, and you start having the random sound effects and the laugh, the sort of, stomach hurting, cringy laughing, and all this other stuff, is just the insanity, going on in a brain that's so disconnected with reality, and how unhealthy that is.
Yes, I mean, spiritually, it's a disaster, really, isn't it? As a comedian, I think it was Stuart Lee said when he was arguing oh yes, he was arguing against somebody and said, yes, but you can prove anything with facts. And it's like, yeah, but that's the point, isn't it? Jesus, I mean, that is, but it was almost, yeah, but but that's still wrong. It's like, it's a difficult one, isn't it, really? So that's where we're at the moment. Brilliant. The age of stupid. So then, so Tolerant World, your second track, is that another optimistic kind of feeling of trying to sort of hold on to some faith?
Yes. So if Dreamworld's dark and depressing, Tolerant World is absolutely much more upbeat. is another one. Well, certainly I did the lyrics on that one. It's one I took the lead on compositionally, and it's interesting that the idea for the lyrics really came from my experience as a professor and a department head. Actually, it's probably a strange place to come up with pop lyrics, but
Yes.
I mean, musically, it's clearly very 60s pop. I'd like to think quality, but for the lyrics, I think, which is probably more interesting as far as a story goes, it's kind of a comparison. So I'm kind of Generation X, I guess, if you want to label it. It was definitely not the situation growing up that I was referring to in Dreamworld. It was very real, very interactive, very independent. And so, School of Hard Knocks, that sort of thing. But my experience with the younger generation, both professors and students over the years, let's just say the millennial generation, very different, like much less independent. And you'll see a lot people, especially on social media, whining and complaining, like my generation, about that generation. I think that's overdone. Certainly I get it a little bit, but I'm also not naive enough to think that just because I grew up in a certain generation that it's the right one. I think that's very naive and ignorant. And so part of the writing lyrics was my annoyance with my own generation and their closed-mindedness, and also the mythology that they work so hard to build up and put out there. It's just nonsense, a lot of it. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And I also think it's the type of closed-mindedness that my generation as young people fought against, and now they're being that as older people.
Yes.
And so my thing was kind of like, okay, the younger generations kind of look at my generation, particularly millennials, and just go, what's wrong with these people? They're so angry and weird and not nice to be around. And so the first verse is me explaining why. So I'm rough around the edges and I quarrel a little too much. And then I say, I don't know if I've always been like this, but you have to understand, I didn't grow up in your tolerant world. So I'm a product of my environment. And then the second verse is about me observing the positives of their generation. How they work together well and they're a lot kinder to each other, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think that's necessarily a weakness. And so I think that if I were to sum up the lyrics of A Tolerant World is, we need to take the best of both going forward. Of course, right? That's what you always want to do. You want to progress, but you don't want to discount everything that we've sorted out before either.
Yes.
Want to reinvent the wheel every generation, but we don't want to be arrogant and ignorant. That's a bad combination.
Terrible combination. Yes. Well, I sort of cringe at this. I don't know if it's arrogance, but sort of going, oh, in my day it was marvelous. And I'm sort of like, I cannot remember one moment that we all sort of woke up in the morning and went, God, this is great to be alive. We just moaned and whined and criticized and, went, oh, I wish I was born in a different period of life. The 80s wasn't full of happy, shiny people. And also the other thing is there was a lot of smoking and drinking, which the younger generation have seemed to have cracked on. And I think, that's quite a clever thing to do as well, actually. So there was far too much, I didn't smoke, but there was a lot of people smoked and drunk too much. And it was a bit messy at times, but the music was amazing, but I can't remember anybody being very happy and optimistic in the 80s at all. Not in the UK anyway. But we're British, we moan all the time. That's what we do. And then talk about the weather. It's great. I know, it's good stuff, isn't it? So then the track 12 Strings and Tambourines. Where was this one? How did this one form?
Well, so this is one that Sean took the lead on. And so for Sean, a big part of Sean's creativity, well, not a big part, but a part of it, and I think a very charming part of it, is he likes to parody things. So he's a very sarcastic person by nature, and which makes him a riot, to be quite honest. It's why he's the Madman. And
yes.
And so for him, also a massive Beatles fan, so there are obvious and intentional Tomorrow Never Knows sort of quotes in there musically. We sort of put the seagulls in there. The drum beat alternates between a complete copy of Ringo's beat together with other stuff we're doing. So we're trying to be not so subtle about that. And the lyrics are a homage to our love of not only the Beatles, but the whole of the psychedelic 60s. So 12 strings and tambourines, right? So George and John on 12 strings, Roger McGuinn of the Byrds,
Yes.
just us saying we're not going to, we are completely out about our love of the 60s. And in particular, if any of our punk friends, want to throw something at us for that, that's fine, because we don't care. One of the things I loved about punk is the fact that you can be unapologetically independent, even if you anger other punks. In some sense, that's the punkest thing of all.
Yes. Well, it was quite funny seeing Steve Jones and the Sex Pistols strumming his guitar, sort of mostly in the bathroom and sitting on the toilet. But he just loved Steely Dan. There was a particular Steely Dan track that he absolutely adored, and I think it's all crept out, hasn't it? That people went, actually, I don't, it's my real love is this, which is completely different to their on-stage persona. So it does happen, doesn't it? Really, which I was quite amazed, really, and pleased about as well. So Adam Street, just to explain the sort of nucleus for Adam Street.
Certainly. So Adam Street was a song. So I had written a lot of music for that documentary that you mentioned, the Agnew family documentary.
Yes, that classic.
Yes. And so, about that time when I my family was approached by the filmmaker to do this project, it was kind of natural. It's about musicians, and so it would kind of be nice if the musicians could actually provide some of the music, some of the soundtrack. And I had written quite a bit for that. And Adam Street was one of the songs I had written. And so Adam Street, the lyrics is very much sort of a retrospective of some of the highlights of growing up in suburban Fullerton in Orange County. Some of my earliest memories from childhood, and it was really magical. My parents did a fantastic job of creating that sort of magical childhood environment in the 70s. This was a time when one parent could actually stay home
yes.
and actually cultivate the family life, rather than, what ended up happening to a lot of us in the 80s is the second parent had to go to work. And so we became the latchkey kids, who are kind of raising ourselves at 12 and 13. But earlier in the 70s, so 0 to 10 was really kind of a magical time, a kind of Leave It to Beaver-ish from a home point of view. And so it was revisiting a lot of those impressions. In 1976 was the bicentennial for the US. And that was kind of like a magical time for children, because there was such a big deal made of it, unlike what happened this year. There was such a big deal made of it. And it was also a time when I started growing up a little bit, even though, so in 76, I was 7 years old. And I remember I had the first melancholy thought that I could recall. So after all of the celebration, it was late on July 4th, and I was laying there kind of exhausted, just, sort of laying on the sofa, just sort of staring into nothingness. And I had this disturbing but profound thought that I will not be able to see the tricentennial. I won't be alive then. And for a 7-year-old, it was kind of like my first existential thought. But like with often those thoughts, that could be used as a source of despair, or it could be a call to action. So the beginning of the end of my childhood happened there. So it was the peak, in some sense, of my childhood magic and excitement, and the beginning of my adulthood in some sense. So that played a role in the lyrics, because it was, it made a deep impression on me. And then also going into adolescence and starting, to form romantic attachments and things like that. The earliest form of romantic attachments is pretty much, I think, where the song sort of drops off, and getting into music and starting that, playing shows and taking it seriously. That's kind of where the song ends. So it's kind of like 0 to 14.
Yeah, God, that's amazing, isn't it? And what was it, just on that, yes, the film. So when did this, because it came out last year, did you, whose idea was it? And were you all excited by it?
Yeah, for sure. So I want to, I don't, I'll probably get the year wrong, but this is going to be close enough to make the point. I think a band called the Detours, which was a, sort of a preliminary band to say the Adolescents and DI. That's not quite correct, but it's the simplest way to put it. So this was a band from the late 70s, was extremely early for punk in Southern California, one of the very first. It was sort of a band that sort of intersected with the earliest form of social distortion as well. And so this band, the Detours, will sometimes, again, legacy act, come out once every couple of years to play a show. We were playing a show at this nice place called the Observatory, and we were all hanging out backstage, and the filmmaker was back there. We were all having fun, and things were getting loose. And he's like, "Hey, I should do the Agnew family as the subject of my next film." And the filmmaker Gabriel Zaval is a friend of my oldest brother Rick, it's like, yeah, sure, whatever. Sounds great. So it was something that sort of came out of the moment at that show. And the filmmaker actually followed up on it.
Right.
And so, this is kind of, again, as usual, a DIY sort of thing. So it wasn't a big budget, corporate backing, nothing like that. And so it was something that he was filming pretty much for the next 7 years until, we were filming pretty much up to a couple months before it was finally released. So it was a long-term project. COVID really probably made it take twice as long as it probably would have otherwise. And yeah, we were all pretty excited about it. I think, it was difficult on the filmmaker though, because it was very difficult to get all three brothers in the same room at the same time.
Yes.
We're all very busy doing, various things. We don't necessarily all live in the same town. And so, for him, it was a bit like herding cats. So I think it was difficult, but it was also a labor of love. He had, he was someone who had a lot of respect for our family and what we accomplished in the scene and how it influenced him and other people growing up, particularly people who didn't, fit into the standard social framework. So yeah, it was a pleasure. We all were excited about it. It would be difficult sometimes because for several years we sort of had a camera pointed at us. It was a period of time where my parents were very elderly. In fact, both my parents passed away during that period. So it's difficult. I can't imagine people like Bowie and Elton John and especially the Beatles. To have such a not public life.
Yes.
Such a not private life. Excuse me. So my family, we're more of a regional thing, I think. There are people who know us in Europe and other places, but it's nothing like those people I mentioned, And so, the way that they handle it with such grace blows me away because, during those years when there were cameras all over the place during some kind of private and sensitive times, I can't imagine that being 24/7.
Yes, well, absolutely, it was, but it's because I've seen quite a few of these kind of films, and there's the Red Cross one is quite interesting for various
Yeah.
reasons. And again, one becomes slightly addicted to the story. A rock story always, I just realize how I'm so easily like, yes, I'll watch it, whether it's, I don't know, there was the band Kansas or Chicago, those sort of bands.
Sure.
By the end of it, you're sort of like, wow, that is just amazing. How does it all happen? So did it feel, when you had the screening, did it feel a little bit like, oh my God, this is going to be a bit odd?
Certainly. It was like a lot of things, a mixture of excitement, pride, and terror. And like, okay, once this gets out of the bag, you can't put it back in, So it's scary. And a lot of times during the making of the film, I was just sitting there going, oh my God, can I handle this information, being so public, I'm probably fairly self-conscious,
Yes.
but then there's a little voice inside the head saying, no, these are and of course the filmmaker was very good about saying, look, you don't understand. The things that are making you the most anxious are the things that the people that are going to endear you the most to the people. You're human. You know what I mean? Life is messy. And out of all of that chaos and imperfection comes some profoundly beautiful things and some beautiful moments and beautiful people. And these people being human, there's also ugliness and unfortunate, like it's the whole human drama, right?
Yes.
And we love watching it when it's not us, but when it's us, we would like to curate what other people see a little bit more closely, but that's not the right thing to do in this case. So, there was a lot of counseling, I might say, from people to like, look, just relax and let it go. Be proud of who you are.
Yes. Well, yes. And I guess once it's there and it's done and you've, crawl out the bed the next day and walk down the street going, God, I feel a little bit different, but it's going to be all right. Yes. Like you said, it's having that sense of exposure. So just going back, yes, I must try and get to see the film. But going back to the album then, just a few more songs, which are kind of curious. Temple of Madness. Where did this little number come from?
So this is clearly more late 60s if we're going to use that comparison. And this is a terrific Sean Madness number, just insanity. I recall when he was writing it and when the idea was cultivating in his head, he was listening to the album Love by Iron Butterfly.
Right.
Which you'd have to ask Sean, but I don't think Iron Butterfly is necessarily like top 10 with Sean or anything. But I know Iron Butterfly used to amuse Sean a lot. And I remember having In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, the album, at home growing up alongside with Pink Floyd's Metal and all the other ones we talked about. And, so I think what was amusing Sean at the time was, first of all, the idea that In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, where did that even come from, those words? And I guess, so the rumor, I haven't, fact checked this, but my understanding is that Iron Butterfly, sort of a heavy rock prog band from San Diego, not just down the street from us, but we're heavy partiers. And so they would have these long jams and they'd be a little bit out of their mind. And I guess they had this song called In the Garden of Eden.
Right.
But if you slur that sufficiently, it comes out In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, and they just ran with it. I don't know if that's true or revisionist history, but I love the story anyway. And so the idea of sort of singing so sloppy that sort of the lyrics that you meant to say versus the lyrics that end up becoming minted in people's minds are completely different. And so this one, Temple of Madness, is in that spirit of very heavy, the singing not too clean. In fact, we've redid the vocals a few times because we thought the first couple takes we overdid that.
Right.
In fact, I was going to name the song, like if you were to write it out, it would look very confusing. Meda Mesa Mahar, and so if you sing that with a sufficiently horrible, drunk, 23-year-old accent, it looks like you're saying some sort of, foreign language, non-English, but it's not. It's just made a mess of my heart.
Right.
Sufficiently slurred, but we try, sometimes we get very exaggerated. We think, maybe we better pull back a little bit. So we ended up calling it Temple of Madness. We thought that was a more engaging title. But it's got some prog, it's kind of prog, real hard rock elements, and we wanted to make it pretty intense. We wanted it to be a little bit of a panorama, something a little bit longer, but we wanted to make sure it was memorable. But that's by far the heaviest song on the album.
Yes, God. It's actually, unfortunately, I was probably a bit easily there, but I had a friend, but I worked with someone who was an old hippie, and he would say, oh, you've got to get that album. And Iron Butterfly were one of those, like, oh, no, don't touch them. So I probably was a bit influenced by him, actually. So I should go and listen to it one day. It was just certain bands that, just got dismissed quite quickly from certain people that, I suppose you think of them as tastemakers or some drastic thing. So back on the album then, Nuclear Boy, what's this one about?
Oh, that's a favorite of ours. So there was this not very well-known band in the early 80s called 2020. they weren't that popular. They put out a couple albums. They came out again, kind of another pop Beatlesque revival that happened post-punk, but still while punk was going on. So this is the early 80s, 80 through 82, 83 maybe. Have you ever heard the band the Plimsouls?
Yes.
Yes. So, they played a 12-string Rickenbacker, had jangly songs, very 60s. So they were part of that scene. There was this kind of pop revival that kind of also overlapped with new wave a little bit, that sort of synthy new wave. And so they were part of that crowd, but they didn't make it quite as popular as the Plimsouls. But they were bands that Sean and I were attracted to, even when we were punk, our punkest punk. And, so it's a cover of one of 2020 songs.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah, 2020 has a couple of real gems. And that's one of them, kind of a power pop. We played a lot heavier than they played it, but it's still reasonably power pop, which is one of, my favorite genres.
I think power pop was quite a thing in the US, wasn't it? The USA.
Yeah.
I suppose we had post-punk with people like Elvis Costello and Joe Jackson, and you mentioned XTC, sort of those sort of singers-songwriters who, had a little bit of punk, but they weren't really that punk. They were just very well-crafted songsmiths, really, weren't they? Whereas, right. The Plimsouls featured Peter Case, didn't they?
Yes.
And that was for their Californian scene, which was, it's quite interesting. Because actually that early 80s as well, there was that sort of, was it New Paisley world that sort of appeared as well, which was quite interesting, because we had New Romantics, we had goth, we had psychobilly, but the sort of New Paisley was quite interesting as well. So that kind of all came along. And just lastly then, looking at the album, Songs in My Head, what was this little number? How did this come about?
So this is very much kind of a Broadway-esque kind of thing. So again, it's something that if you sort of look at the lyrics, it's very much a story. Like you imagine, was this based on some story or some scene in a play or something? It's very visually evocative. And so this was an idea so this is very much a Sean song. However, it's something we ended up collaborating on lyrically quite a bit, and also in the production. But the idea is a fairly personal song for Sean as well, because it's first of all about composing. Where do the songs in your head come from, and where do your inspirations come from? The importance of a muse. Things like that. And so I kind of ran with it once he gave me the ideas, and we put this together. And it really is so it turned into a fiction where, it always has a basis in some reality, but then you run with it. You take some artistic license. And so imagine, a composer, it almost kind of makes you feel something in the 1800s, living a good life, and, is very much in love with his wife, and it's his muse. We don't have to be that specific about things, but that's maybe the easiest way to explain it. And so he's working all night. He's by candlelight and struggling to write. But then he hears his partner upstairs, waking up. Perhaps maybe it's early morning, and that inspires him, and he gets a warm feeling inside, and all of a sudden the notes start to appear to him,
right,
like little balloons in his field of vision are the notes, the half notes, the quarter notes, the quavers, and so on and so forth. And he gets the inspiration, as it often really does happen, and boom, all of a sudden it just comes out in a torrent. And then he continues to tell the story about seeing her come down the stairs. She doesn't know I'm aware, but I'm observing her and being really inspired by that. So graceful, preparing the tea, sits down in her chair next to me. However, if you take the lyrics all the way through, it becomes vague whether or not she's alive, whether she's there, whether it's in his head, whether she's a ghost. So we try to leave a lot open to interpretation and ambience and atmosphere, and so people can get out of it what they need and want to get out of it. So I might say it's a ghost story. That's the way I had it.
Nice, my God. And with recording the album, did you all get together in the studio, or did you, send your, pieces in? How does that process work now?
It was a combination. We've done most of our work with the good old internet. So Sean and I work together. I have a home studio that's well equipped, and then Rat is south of London. He does his stuff either in a studio or he has his own ability to record drums at home. And then Paul's in Cardiff. He has a little setup there. He can record his bass tracks, and they'll send the tracks to us. So we do. So Sean and I do pre-production. We
Right.
send those tracks typically to Rat first. Rat will lay down his tracks, send them to us. We'll do the editing, send the result to Paul, and Paul is just brilliant at riffing off of what Rat does. That's why we kind of like that order. I mean, Rat could do that as well, but this is just a workflow that's worked really well. And he'll send it back to us, and then Sean and I sort of redo any tracks that are necessary of our own, lay down final vocals, backing vocals, tidbits, and then go through a rather elaborate editing, mixing, and mastering process at our home studio. That's how we've done 90% of all our production. However, on this album, 3 of the songs we all went. So Sean and I flew out. We rented time at Abbey Road and spent a day recording. Tolerant World, Nuclear Boy, and Brand New World were done at Abbey Road. Being that this was something that was really focusing on our 60s type material, we thought, let's do something special. Let's go ahead and do Abbey Road, as much as we can.
That must have been amazing.
Highlight of the last 30 years, at least for me. I mean, I was electric. It was on fire. I mean, I had grown up watching and worshiping bands like the Beatles and Pink Floyd working in those studios. So I knew just from pictures what those studios look like. And you could tell, obviously they've been modernized and stuff, but especially Studio 2, not that different in terms of the space and the shape. And, they were so good to us there. I can't tell you how good the staff was there. They knew why we were there. And, they rolled out Mrs. Mills, they rolled out some of the other pianos, that John and Paul had played. And, we were like kids in a candy store. It was incredible pressure because of that. But it was also the type of pressure where you go, you know what? I am just going to leave it all on the table. I don't even care.
Yes.
And I think it really worked out for the best. I think it got the best out of us.
Well, God, I mean, as I remember sort of thinking many years ago about, like you're thinking about the regrets you might have, and you might think, all the wish you had is you sort of sitting or laying in your bed, in those moments thinking, I wish, you'll think, I'm glad I did that. I'm glad but I wish I hadn't gone to so many work meetings, those moments in life where you think you're not going to remember them only in slight resentment, but the Abbey Road experience is going to be like, oh my God, that was everything. That was
top 10.
It
no
was
doubt.
there, and I guess you saw that the 8-hour film of the Beatles recording and making Let It Be,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
that
I'd get
was
back as soon as I could watch it.
yes. I thought I might just see, and then it was like 8 hours later, you think, right. God, I can't believe I just can't. It was just so gripping, wasn't it? It was just the best film ever. And I love the fact that they got those recordings, which, like the microphone in the flowers or something like that between John and Paul. I just thought, Jesus, could you imagine so many bands that you think, God, that would have been like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones doing Exile on Main Street, or just those conversations and that atmosphere. We were so lucky to get that film, it was just
absolutely.
Oh, there you go. And so the album, is it coming out August 2026? Is that
So it'll be released for streaming on August 7th, and then the CDs and the vinyl will be released shortly thereafter. So hopefully on the 7th, but sometimes the production schedule can be a little a little different, especially with vinyl. It's a little bit more difficult to predict exactly when things are going to come through, but certainly all this stuff is going to be available. Well, it's available for pre-order now, but the whole album, we've released 2 singles, but the whole album will be available during streaming at least on the 7th for sure. And either on the 7th or shortly thereafter, the physical merchandise will be available.
It'll be appearing. Will you be doing some live dates?
At this point, we don't have any setup. The timing is particularly bad because both Paul and Rat are now back in the Damned and have been for the last year or two. But when we first got this project going, they were not. And in fact, Sean and I used to joke, it would be wonderful if somehow we could assist that process. We didn't at the time. It didn't seem like it would be very likely, but things change and people change. And now, Paul and Rat are back in the Damned, and it's a glorious thing and it sounds wonderful. But it's their 50th anniversary. So they have an extremely busy schedule. Even without that, the last couple of years, they've been touring. It feels like nonstop. I don't know how they do it. I don't know if I could have that kind of energy to keep that kind of schedule. But it's going to get even more intense, and it's been really intense. So the timing wasn't great in terms of doing live dates for our project. And of course, we're a lesser well-known project than the Damned. The Damned is very, very well known by now. A strong legacy. So for us, it's a little bit more of a boutique. Let's pick some special dates, kind of like we did with the 100 Club. That was well attended. But if we did, tons and tons of dates all over the place in every small town, I'm not sure we'd be able to draw a ton.
Yeah.
At this point, that's not like for Professor and the Madman, even when it was just Sean and I, it was about, we need an outlet for our compositions. Perhaps someone will like 1 or 2 of them. It wasn't really so much about the live dates. Both Sean and I think as much as we enjoy playing live, and I certainly enjoy playing live, perhaps even more than Sean. And I think we both are still most happy in the studio and composing and creating. And if we can play live under good conditions, good sound, a good venue, decent travel accommodations,
yes.
then it's because we're not 22 years old anymore. We don't mind flopping on a couch with a bunch of dogs in when we're 22, but at this point it's not quite as practical. We're certainly not trying to make a living by becoming pop stars or anything like that. We create music, and we think there might be people who might really enjoy hearing it.
Yeah.
So that's our first priority. At some point, though, if something comes up, it would be fantastic. Maybe the Damned's, 50th anniversary starts winding down, and we all get the itch to do something. I think it would be fantastic to do a couple special shows, particularly in the UK, where most of our fans are from.
Yeah, God, that'd be fantastic. Well, look, thank you ever so much for your time. This has been amazing. And just the name bit, is it Alfie or Alfonso?
So I was born Alfonso.
Yes.
Alfonso Fernandez Agnew. My grandfather was Mexican on my mom's side, and so I took the name from. I was given the name from him, and the middle name is the matronymic, right? The sort of my mom's maiden name. And like many California families, kind of a mix between Anglo and Mexican. It's a very common California thing, the sort of Pedro O'Toole thing, right?
Yes.
And so professionally, my nickname is Al. Officially, my name is Alfonso. I've always been known in the music environment as Alfie.
Right. Yes.
Is kind of my music name. People won't know the name Alfonso, sometimes not at all.
No. Okay. Well, I'll remember that, but that would be good. Well, look, thank you ever so much. I've loved to listen to the album, and good old Randy. That's been amazing. And yes, like I said, I'll listen to it now after your little description of some of these songs with slightly new ears, actually. But anyway, look, I'll let you go, and I better get to bed. But thank you again for your time. Sorry about that first hour, but that's life. Yeah. Okay, look, take care. I hope you have a nice summer, and good luck for the album. Actually, it's all good.
Thank you so much, David. Pleasure to talk to you.
Yes, thanks again. Take care. See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that was me in conversation with Alfie Agnew, talking about his life in music and also the current project Professor and the Madman, available from all good download sites. And I'll put a link in the notes below. But this is the C86 show, David Eastaugh. Have a great week. Stay safe.